So with this, you record yourself, analyze your answers, and repeat the process. Don't move on to any new questions until you feel that you've mastered your original list. A student asked me for advice about avoiding pauses and hesitations in part 3 of the speaking test. So here are some tips. First, don't worry too much about this. It's normal, even for native speakers, to pause or hesitate to some extent. The more you worry, the more likely you are to hesitate. Don't overthink if you are thinking about grammar, linking, or using difficult words. You're more likely to hesitate. Just focus on answering the question with the first idea that comes into your head. And slow down. Many candidates speak too quickly. Hesitation or repetition occurs because their brains can't work fast enough to keep up. I'm having to do this all the time in the classroom, telling students that they're just speaking too quickly. And you can't speak English as quickly as you speak Vietnamese. So just slow down, but not too slowly, because then you could actually lose marks if you're speaking too slowly. So here's the main piece of advice, is practice. As I said before, make yourself a collection of IELTS speaking questions and practice them without hesitating. And don't just practice this once, go through your list of questions many times, every day if possible. And you'll find that you gradually improve, both in terms of the quality of your answers and in terms of fluency and lack of hesitation. Maybe you could even record yourself, perhaps once a week, so that you can analyze your own performance. Let's look at real opinions and experiences. So some students are worried about expressing their real opinions in part 3 of the speaking test. They think that the examiner might disagree and therefore give a lower score. Don't worry about this, the examiner only cares about your language. Express your opinions, talk about your interests, and give examples from your own experience. The examiner will find real opinions and experiences more interesting than general superficial answers. If the examiner if the examiner does disagree with you, then what they are trying to do is test your ability to further explain why you have a certain opinion. And I'll show you an IELTS Part 3 video in a few minutes, and you will see that the examiner did this. She disagreed with the candidate to test his ability to explain something. Eye contact is another important thing in part 3. When answering questions, most people naturally make eye contact with the examiner, as this is a natural part of a discussion. However, the examiner will not reduce your score for lack of eye contact, but he or she will reduce your score if you don't answer the question well. So what's most important? Well, here are the factors that might affect your speaking score. Fluency, so not hesitating too much. Linking ideas together. Your answer structure and organization. Use of ideas. Use of vocabulary, use of grammar, and use of pronunciation. But which of these factors are most important? In part 3, focus on your answer structure. This will force you to give long answers without repeating yourself. You don't really have time to think about good vocabulary or grammar. Just worry about answering the question by following the structure steps explained during today's workshop. Notice that I don't recommend worrying about grammar or linking at any point in the speaking test. Finally, if you forget every other exam tip, just remember one thing: answer the question. So, here are 3 simple tips that could make a difference to your score. Firstly, be confident. Although you might be nervous, try to speak clearly and confidently. Smile and be friendly with the examiner. Tell yourself that you have prepared well and that you are going to enjoy the challenge. Don't treat the examiner as a stranger, but don't treat the examiner as your best friend. Just be a little bit friendly, and the examiner will respond. Know that you are prepared. You will feel much more confident if you know that you have prepared and practiced for the test. You should know exactly what to expect. For example, have you prepared some common topics? And are you ready for a past and a future question in part 3? Speak naturally. Try to enjoy a normal conversation with the examiner. Instead of worrying about your grammar, listen carefully to the questions and try to give natural answers. Most of the questions in part 3 are about your opinions, so it's best to be open. When I used to be an examiner, I always found the job more interesting when students spoke openly about their opinions and experiences. And a final note, you're not marked on body language, but I'd still recommend that you try to act in a friendly, confident manner. Now, things to avoid. Avoid these phrases. In the speaking test, examiners don't like it when students use phrases like, "That's a very interesting question." It is my personal opinion that. I am of the opinion that. To be honest, I personally believe that. These phrases sound unnatural. And it's obvious to the examiner that the student has memorized them. So what should you do instead? My advice, just answer the question directly. Stop using memorized phrases and just get straight to the point. And believe me, when I talk to examiners these days, they constantly complain about students using memorized answers when answering questions. And in fact, if they're being very strict on the marking system, they could give you a band 4 vocabulary for memorized answers. So don't do it. Just try and speak naturally. Another thing you should try and do is make sure you finish the test strongly. So by the end of speaking part 2, many IELTS candidates are exhausted and just want the exam to end. Consequently, they don't do as well as they could in part 3. Ever since I noticed this problem as an examiner, I've told my students to make sure that they master the 3-step or sometimes 4-step method that you'll see below. Practice answering as many questions as you can using the answer, explain, example, alternative method. If you can get into the habit of following these steps, you'll You'll finish the speaking test strongly and make a good final impression to the examiner. All right, that's the introduction over. We're going to do a quiz now, and I want you to put your answers on the group chat. I think we have about 10 questions about IELTS Speaking Part 3. So I'll put the question on the screen, and then I'll give you the answer after a few seconds. So, first question, how many minutes does Part 3 of the test last? How many minutes? Put your answer on the chat. Yes, the instructions do say 45 minutes. And actually in training, examiners are required to make sure that Part 3 lasts between 4 minutes 30 seconds and 4 minutes 45 seconds. Next question. How long should your answer be? So how long should your answer to a Part 3 question be? You can answer it in sentences or seconds. How long? Nope, it's not 10 sentences. It's not 25 seconds. It's not 1 minute, no. Not 2 to 3 minutes. Anybody else want to try? Yeah, ASUS is nearly there. Answer. 3 to 4 sentences, which is about 35 to 45 seconds. That's the requirement for the examiner. So, how many questions will you get in Part 3? How many? How many questions must an examiner give you? 2 to 3. Now, there is a minimum number of questions for Part 3 that an examiner has to ask you. Think about it, it's up to 5 minutes, and your answer should be 35 to 45 seconds. So, how many questions are you likely to get? Yeah, not Ling, you're nearly there. Yeah. So, the minimum number of questions in Part 3 is 5. The examiner has to ask you 5 questions, and the maximum will be 8. Right, Part 1 speaking is a question and answer section. How would you describe Part 3? How is it different? It's not a question and answer. What is Part 3? Give me an adjective or a noun to describe it. How is Part 3 different? All right, nobody wants to try? No, Part 3 is not a combination of Part 1 and Part 2, no. It's very different. Yeah, ACES is correct. It's a discussion between two people. It's a two-way discussion. And I actually say to my students, part three is connected to part two, yeah. It's the same topics. And I say to my students, part three is not a speaking test. It's not. It's a discussion about opinions and ideas. And you need a certain amount of general knowledge to answer some of the questions. So it's very different than a traditional speaking test. Next question. What type of question would you expect to get first in part three? No, you wouldn't get a pros and cons, no. No, you wouldn't get a comparison question in first question, no. It could be about your opinion, yes. It could be an opinion style question, that's quite possible. Yeah, an opinion, why, what type of question in the plural form. Example, what type of holidays do people in Vietnam prefer? Could be the first question in part three. What type of holidays do people in Vietnam prefer? Notice it's holidays in the plural form. So do not make the mistake of speaking about only one type of holiday. You must give more than one example because the question is in the plural form. And time again, you will find it is that type of question that is the first one in part three. And you're expected to give more than one example to answer it. Can you give personal examples in part three speaking? Is that allowed? Or must you do something different? Yeah, let's have a look. Yes, you can. But you should also try to give specific examples about other people or other things or other places, so that you are basically you're comparing your own personal idea or example with others. Can you disagree with a question? Can you do that? Answer, yes you can, but you must explain why. Example. Question. Why do many older people find it difficult to change? Why do many older people find it difficult to change? Well, being from an older generation, I might very well disagree with that question and say, actually, I don't agree with that. I don't think that it's many older people have problems changing. In fact, I can give you examples of recent experience of younger people finding it difficult to change, and then give an actual example. See what else we got. Another question. As well as opinion, why, what questions? Can you name other question types in part 3? Other question types. What are the other question types in part 3? Anybody know? Solutions, yeah. So you could be asked for a solution to a problem question. That's possible. Any other question types? I think forecast, you mean speculate, something about the future. I think what you mean, window. Yep, you can speculate, yep. Any other types? Evaluate. Not quite sure what you mean by evaluate. Not quite sure. When we mean evaluate, we're usually talking about evaluating some evidence. Let's have a look. So comparison, present and past, advantages, disadvantages, problem solutions, causes, effects, speculate about the future. So think about it. These are also type of questions you could get in task 2 writing essays. And in fact, quite often I say to students, well, task 2 writing and part 3 speaking, they're basically the same thing. It's just one you write and the other one you talk about it. All right, that's the end of the quiz. Let's have a look at a video. And I'll stop it every so often to make some points, okay? Let's have a look at the video.
We've been talking about a well-known person you like or admire, and I'd like to discuss with you 1 or 2 more general questions related to this. Let's consider, first of all, famous people in your country. So in Singapore, what sorts of people become famous?
Mainly politicians, prominent businessmen, and a growing number of television celebrities.
Any film celebrities?
There are not too many film celebrities because the film industry in Singapore is still growing. There is a producer who has been involved in the production of quite a few comedies. His name is Jack Neo, and he is quite famous in Singapore.
Now, what about in the past? Would you say that the kinds of people famous in the past are different?
I think there is a growing number of television celebrities, mainly because the television industry has sort of matured in Singapore. But other than that, I think it's pretty much the same.
And what about in the future? Can you make any predictions on who might be famous in the future?
I think successful young business people would be more famous in the future, mainly because they give the youth of today something to aspire towards, and they basically send out a message that it's not just the older generation that can achieve in terms of business success, but that younger generations can aspire towards that as well.
So straight away, we've had some quite typical general questions, and we're now 1 minute 30 into the test. He's answered 2 questions, so he clearly understands what the examiner wants from him, and he's giving examples. Let's see what happens next.
Now let's talk about celebrity culture. Often famous people are used in advertising. Can you give me some examples of that?
Famous people being used in advertising. I think one example that comes to mind is celebrities being used to promote charitable causes. And I think basically, because celebrities have reached a certain status in society whereby people aspire towards reaching celebrity status, when you have celebrities endorsing a cause, it's basically saying that I am so and so and I approve this, and in that way I think the general population aspire towards that and they feel more comfortable, for example, donating to that cause.
Do you think it might be a bit dangerous having a celebrity endorse a cause if, for example, that celebrity behaves in a manner which the cause does not agree with?
I think
so. Now the examiner is actually disagreeing with him. Let's see how he answers it.
it could potentially be harmful. And it's not necessarily for causes. I think it's also for celebrity behaviors, because a lot of the youth of today try to emulate celebrities. They may not be aware of the repercussions of certain acts that they commit.
So what about those negative repercussions? What kind of possible negative effects might happen to youth due to their admiration of famous people?
I think with a lot of the youth of today, especially young females, they may idolize certain celebrities and they become very conscious of their body image, and that may not necessarily be very healthy.
Do you think that affects males equally?
I think it does affect males to a certain extent, but not on the same level that it would affect females, because I think a lot of young females are more conscious of their body image than a lot of young males are.
What kind of negative effects would boys have?
I think for example, with the young female population, I think a lot of them would be susceptible to maybe things like anorexia and bulimia, whereas with boys it's not so prevalent, but it could still happen.
How about influencing public opinion? How might famous people be used to influence public opinion?
I think they could be used to affect public opinion positively. For example, you've got Bono, who is all for HIV and AIDS awareness. I think he's done something very positive for AIDS awareness on a global level.
Can you think of any negative ways they might influence public opinion?
I can't think of any negative ways at this point.
Well, thank you very much. That's the end of the speaking test.
All right, so let's have a look. In part 3, can the examiner ask a question out of the script? Yes, the examiner must ask one question minimum out of the script. That's the instructions, yeah. And in fact, they can ask more than one if they want. Let's go back. So, what do you think was his band score? Anybody want to try and guess what you think was his band score? What did he get? Eight. 8.5. Any different than 8 at 8.5? Anybody think 9? 7? 7.5? 8? That's how he was marked. Got an 8.5. Marked for 8 for fluency because of some hesitation. Notice the last question, he said he didn't have an idea to answer it. That's fine. If you don't have an idea, just say that to the examiner. You don't know. And the examiner will just move on to the next question. You will not lose marks for not knowing or providing an idea to answer a question on just one occasion. You won't lose any marks. The examiner will just move on. The examiner does not expect you to be an expert on everything. All right, let's have a look at speaking part 3, structure and examples. So most of the examples I'm going to give you today are actually questions that are on the test at present. So in speaking part 3, you need to think in terms of paragraphs. You should try to give longer, detailed answers. A good way to do this is to imagine you are making a paragraph. So we have the system called idea, explain, and examples. So start with a direct answer to the question, like the topic sentence in a written paragraph. Then explain your answer in more detail and support your explanation with an example. So try answering this question. Do you think that it's important for people to celebrate their achievements? How would you answer that? Well, clearly, direct answer, yes, I do. I agree that it's very important. This can happen in a variety of ways. For example, quite recently, I graduated from high school, and my friends and I, we had a small party at a restaurant. If you want, you can give a second example to support that. So let's have another example. Again, start with a direct answer, then explain it by giving 2 or 3 reasons and maybe an example too. So again, another question. Why do you think some people prefer not to tell others about their achievements? Why do you think that might happen? Well, you could answer it, well, I agree, this might sometimes happen. When I was told unofficially that I received a scholarship to go and study in Australia, I didn't tell anybody until I'd actually received confirmation in writing from the university. So it was an important secret that I kept actually for more than a week. So follow the steps in your head. So when answering questions in part 3 of the speaking test, you should have 3 or maybe 4 steps that you follow. So again, look at the list, give a direct answer, explain with a reason or reasons, give an example. So you can give a personal example, that's okay. And then you can extend your answer by explaining the opposite or alternative. So you could do this with an advantages, disadvantages question quite easily. You can also do it with a speculating question about the future. So here's a question currently on the speaking test. Why do you think people like taking photos of themselves and others? So direct answer. I think the main reason why people take photos of themselves and their family and friends is to collect memories. Explain. What I mean is that photos are like souvenirs that remind us of special moments in the past. People like looking back over their lives and seeing what they were doing or how young they looked at a particular time. Here's the example. My niece is a good example. She takes selfies wherever she goes, somewhere interesting, and she loves to look through them with her friends. So that's the 3-step answer. Let's have a look at a 4-step answer. So, question, do you think it's ever worth hiring a professional photographer? Answer, yes, for certain special occasions, I definitely think it's best to pay a professional to take photos. Explain. A professional photographer is like to have a better camera and related equipment, and you would hope that at the end of the result will be a set of stunning photographs. Personal example, thinking back to a wedding that I attended last summer, I remember that the photographer knew exactly what he was doing, and he took some great photos of the bride and groom and guests. And then this is where you could actually extend your answer further. So without pay professional, you would have to rely on a friend or family members to take photos. And I think this would be risky. I don't think you can trust an amateur when it's a once in a lifetime event. Excuse me, spelling. Event. Here's another example currently on the speaking test in part 3. Do you think it's better to have clear aims for the future, or is it best to take each day as it comes? Answer, I think it's best to have a good idea of what you want to do with your life, especially in terms of studies and career. Having aims allows you to plan what you need to do today and tomorrow in order to achieve longer-term objectives. For example, if you want to become a doctor, you need to choose the right subjects at school, get the right exam results, and work hard at university. And here's the opposite. Without a clear aim, it will be impossible to take the necessary steps towards a career in medicine or any other profession. So this answer is 4 sentences, and it would probably take you somewhere around 35 to 40 seconds to complete that answer. Now, another thing we can look at is common question types. So here are 3 examples: compare and contrast, give an opinion, or imagine, or speculation. Again, we have 3 questions that are currently on the test. How is life different in cities compared to rural areas? How do you think life in big cities could be made easier? And what do you think cities will be like in 50 years' time? So, in my answers below, I've underlined a few markers that show comparisons, opinions, and future predictions. So, firstly, the cost of living in cities is much higher. Housing is much more expensive in cities compared to rural areas, and everything costs more. I think life in cities is more difficult. There are more people, so there's more competition for jobs. Life is a lot slower in rural areas, everyone knows each other, and there's a sense of community. I don't think rural areas experience the social problems that you find in cities, like crime and homelessness. Second question. In my view, cities need to be well planned. Good public transport can definitely make life easier because there are so many people and it can be really stressful just to move around. Public areas like parks are also important because people need space to relax, and I think cities should be made into healthier places to live and work. And then what about in the future? Well, I imagine cities will be less polluted because we'll have electric cars and better public transport. More people might work from home, so maybe cities won't be so busy. But I think there will probably still be problems because many more people are migrating to cities, especially in poorer countries. So I'm not so optimistic about issues like crime, homelessness, and unemployment. So again, we're looking at answer examples of 3 or 4 sentences for each one. What about grammar, you might ask? Well, when answering the 2 questions below, you should be aware that the examiner is expected to see us hear some different verbs and tenses. Again, examples from the test at present. Do you think films have changed since you were a child? Answer, no, I don't think they've changed much. When I was younger, I enjoyed watching action films, and the Hollywood formula for this type of film seems to be the same today. For example, I like the original Superman films, and superheroes are still a popular subject for filmmakers. So there we have an example of past and present tenses. Next question. As the technology for home viewing improves, do you think people will stop going to the cinema in future? No, I don't think that people will, as they can already buy fantastic home viewing equipment, but it still feels more special to share the experience of watching a new film with a theatre full of people. I don't believe that technology will be able to replicate that cinema atmosphere. So again, we're using more than one grammar tense. So let's look at examples. So in part 3 of the speaking test, you should try to give longer, more detailed answers. And a great way to do this is by giving an example. However, I've noticed that students often forget to give an example, even when I've just told them to answer using the 3 steps: direct answer, explain, give an example. So here's the solution to this problem when answering in part 3. Force yourself to say words like, for example, or for instance, if you don't want to repeat. When I force my students to say these words, they always manage to find an example. And the result is that they always give better answers. Try it, just force yourself to say the words, for example, and see what happens. So, let's talk about making answers personal. So, in part 3 of IELTS Speaking, it really helps if you give personal examples. Question. Again, these are questions on the test at present. Do you think it's important for people to have hobbies? Yes, I think people need to have hobbies because we all need to do things we enjoy in our spare time. In my case, I find that playing football once a week with some friends helps me to relax, keep fit, and forget about work. I think it's the same for everyone. Let's see the response to a negative question. Can hobbies have any negative effects? Yes, if you spend too much time on your hobby, it can affect other parts of your life. I remember that one of my friends spent most of his time at university playing computer games instead of studying. In the end, he failed most of his exams. How about the future opinion answers? So again, these are currently on the test. Will large shopping malls continue to be popular despite the growth of internet shopping? Answer, I can't see shopping malls disappearing anytime soon, so yes, I think they will definitely continue to attract shoppers. So that's the answer in the question. Now explain. We already have internet shopping with websites like Amazon, now mainstream. But the large shopping centres in my city are still packed with people. The Trafford Centre near Manchester, for example, is hugely popular. And I think this is because it offers more than just shopping. It's a place where families go for a day out, to have lunch, or to visit attractions like Sea Life or Legoland. And naturally, they will browse the shops and buy things there too. Do you think some businesses, for example banks and travel agents, will only operate online in future? Answer, I'm sure they will, and I think this is already happening. I'm pretty sure that there are online-only savings accounts, and there are travel websites like Airbnb that have no physical presence on the high street. I imagine that more and more services will only be available online. This seems to be the way that things are going. Now, this one here, again, is on the test. So the part 2 question on the current test is about when you visited an historic building. Having ideas and opinion is important for IELTS Speaking Part 3. Even if your grammar is excellent, you will not get a high score if you don't know what to say. And I actually think that questions about buildings and places are some of the most difficult on the test. So if you get part 3 questions on historic buildings, what I've done here related to Hanoi are some examples that you could use. So the question, do you believe whether governments should protect old or historic buildings? So here are some possible ideas or opinions. So historic buildings are part of a country's heritage. So the old quarter to the north of Hoan Kiam Lake. Old buildings are often considered to be works of art. So French-style buildings near Hoan Kiam Lake. They give character to cities and attract tourists. So the Opera House on Changtian Street. We identify countries by architectural symbols, so like the pyramids in Egypt or Cairo, or the one-pillar pagoda in Barding. Government should spend money on looking at historic buildings, so a good example in Hanoi is the Temple of Literature. These buildings need regular repairs and maintenance, and they're very poor for poorer countries. And actually, in my country, the UK, the government gets money from various sources to do this. So every example question and example I'm giving today, all these questions are actually on the test at present. And most of them will continue on the test until the end of this year. So let's go through a few tips and ideas to finish. So slow down. So while you may be marked down by the examiner if you hesitate too often, there's nothing wrong with speaking a bit more slowly and carefully. So as I mentioned before, in my experience, many students speak too quickly, and this causes several problems. So if you speak too quickly, you're more likely to make grammar and pronunciation mistakes, and you'll probably lose clarity and coherence. If you slow down, you'll have more time to think, to pronounce words clearly, and to correct yourself if necessary. One more tip, have you ever practiced pronouncing words like very, very slowly? For example, you can pronounce every individual vowel and consonant sound in the word slowly, so slowly. I've tried this with students and they are not usually very good at it. They find it easier to rush the pronunciation of words. Native speaker children, on the other hand, love pronouncing slowly and do it very well. So maybe it's something that adult language learners could practice more. So what if you don't understand the question? So in part 3 of the test, the examiner is allowed to rephrase the question. If you don't understand, just say something like, sorry, can you explain that question in a different way, please? The examiner is actually required to make sure that candidates understand the question in part 3. In part 1, this doesn't happen. The examiner will not explain a question in part 1. But in part 3, the examiner must do it if asked. Next, don't ask the examiner questions. In the speaking test, some candidates try to involve the examiner in the conversation. For example, examiner, do you think that cooking should be an important life skill? Student? Not really. I think that for many young Vietnamese, they prefer their mother's cooking and are too busy studying, so they don't take the time to learn to cook. And what do you think? So you should definitely not do this. In fact, the only time that you might need to ask a question is if you don't hear what the examiner said. Just say, sorry, can you repeat that, please? So, do the 3 parts of the speaking test carry equal weighting when your score is calculated, or is one part more important? The simple answer is that the 3 parts are not scored separately. The examiner rates the candidate's performance as a whole. So in this sense, neither part is more important. However, it's useful to think about the 3 parts like this. Part 1 is supposed to be quite easy, like a warm-up, so you won't get a high score if you only do well in this part. Part 2 is when the examiner really gets the chance to assess how good you are. And he or she will now have an idea of what scores to give you. And during part 3, the examiner is making his or her final decision. A good performance here in part 3 will boost your score, definitely. If you finish the test strongly in part 3, it can increase your band score, definitely. A couple of tips regarding pronunciation. This is an exercise you could do once a week. Try recording yourself as you answer some IELTS speaking questions. Then listen to the recording and analysing just one feature of pronunciation. For example, you could focus on intonation. Does your voice sound flat and boring? Or do you manage to show interest and enthusiasm? If possible, ask a native speaker to give some answers and listen to the rising and falling of his or her voice. Try to copy that intonation. So English is a language where, spoken naturally, the voice rises and falls. And you could try that for other pronunciation skills such as word stress, sentence stress, and so on. The importance of pronunciation in language learning. So in my opinion, pronunciation is perhaps the most overlooked secret to learning a new language. As a serious language student, you'll learn to recognize and produce sounds that don't exist in your own language. You'll try to copy the connected speech, word stress, sentence stress, and intonation pattern. And as you become better at doing these things, the language starts to open up and welcome you in. Also, your listening skills will improve. You'll find it easy to chat to native speakers, and your repertoire of phrases grows effortlessly. The best language learners' children all know this secret. So, in my experience, in a lot of schools in Hanoi, the Vietnamese teachers, when they do pronunciation, they simply do the theory of pronunciation. And there's very little practice and feedback. But if you have that problem, there are things, as I just mentioned here, you can do yourself. Is your accent important? Well, the truth is, your accent is not important. Pronunciation is only 25% of the marks, and the requirement is that you speak clearly and can be understood. You are not marked on your accent. So stop worrying about your accent and focus on making sure that you speak clearly and can be understood. Now, this is something that some students get confused over. They get told or read in books or on chat sites on the internet that they have to use idioms in the speaking test. It's not true. There's nowhere in the examiner's marking system does it say that you have to use an idiom. Absolutely nowhere. What you must do, though, to get a higher band score is use less common and idiomatic language. So, what are the definitions? Idiomatic is defined in most dictionaries as using, containing, or denoting expressions that are natural to a native speaker. And less common must therefore mean less commonly used by learners of English, not less commonly used by native speakers. I think if you have listened carefully to me today, I doubt that I've used a single idiom in the last hour. I haven't used any. So try to understand how native speakers use the language in their natural environment. Don't go looking in books for idioms. And actually, idiomatic language, a lot of it is based on phrasal verbs. What time did you get up this morning? Example like that. However, if you do try to use an idiom, make sure they're correct. And here are two examples. Look at these two phrases, and are they correct? So, save something for the rainy day and save something for rainy days. Well, actually, both are wrong. Both phrases contain a mistake, and the correct form is save something for a rainy day. So, if you use an idiom, you need to get it exactly right. Even a small mistake in an idiomatic expression makes it sound strange and completely wrong. And as a result, it can have a negative impact on your vocabulary score. And in fact, the examiners get really tired of hearing the same idioms that clearly students have got out of books. So, grammar vocabulary. So it's difficult to think about grammar when you're trying to speak. I think it's much easier to improve your vocabulary than your grammar score. So I've plenty of examples of students who got band 7 in speaking and they make grammar mistakes. The point is, it's the type of mistakes that they make, not the number of mistakes. And don't try and use memorized grammar in structures, because your speech will not sound natural. So if you don't know the answer, what should you do? Well, there are two things you can do. Be honest and explain you don't know, or guess and tell the examiner you are guessing. So there you might say, well, I think it might be, something like that. So example question, how has technology affected the kinds of music that young people listen to? My answer, using both tips above. To be honest, I don't really know the answer to that because I'm completely out of touch with what young people are listening to, and I'm not a fan of pop music. Or the second one, however, I suppose that technology must have affected music. Maybe young people are listening to music that has been made using computer software instead of real musical instruments like the piano or guitar. So we're coming to the end of today's lesson. I hope that's given you lots of ideas. As usual, if you want a copy of these slides, then contact GLN Centre and they will provide you with a copy. Next week, we are going to look at Task 1 writing. A few things there because we haven't done Task 1 writing, I think, for 3 or 4 weeks, so we'll look again. If you have any questions to finish, I'll just wait a few seconds for you to put them on the chat and I will answer them. If you can't think of anything and want a question answering in the future, again, just contact GLN and they'll pass the question through to me for answering. So I hope you found this useful. I'm quite sure you get details in the future, but I'm told there's a big event happening on August the 17th at GLN Handico. And I will be there all day if you want to come and see me. and I'll be doing workshops on speaking and writing. I'll give you more details nearer the time. So thanks for listening. I hope that you'll log in next week, and for the rest of the day, I hope you have a good and interesting time. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Terry. Goodbye.